Your glory I love to see.
Through 18. All right. There's a lot left up here. All right, the questions for Wednesday, covering chapters 19 through 23, are up here. You can get those at the end of class. So we'll be covering that on Wednesday, Lord willing. And Isaiah 15 today. Before we get started, Gerald is going to lead us in word of prayer.
Most gracious, divine Heavenly Father, we come to Thee once again, Father, most grateful for this time that we have this hour of study, that we're together as brothers and sisters and can study Thy Word and draw closer to Thee. We pray, Father, that You'll be with each one of us, be with Jeremiah as he departs our study today, and that we might concentrate on, that we might glean from Thy Scriptures that You would have us to glean. We pray, Father, that You would continue to bless us, continue to have this freedom to come together as brothers and sisters, helping each other in encouragement and studying Thy Word. Continue to bless us. We ask it all in Christ's name. Amen.
All right. Remember, we're in the middle of the section, the second major division of Isaiah in regards to the judgment on foreign nations. Had some prophecies concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the first half, the first 12 chapters ending with that hope in the Messianic time and the rejoicing and praising of Jehovah. And then we get to the judgment on the nations. And we know that God rules in the kingdoms of men. He's not just concerned with Israel and Judah. He's concerned with the entire world. And what He's going to do for the entire world involves Judah. And so we see that they are protected throughout this time, though they are judged to a degree. Jerusalem is not going to be overthrown. Eventually it would be, and a remnant would return. And therefore you would have the Messiah that would be born, and blessings coming to all nations through Israel, through Jerusalem. But for that to happen, who's God going to use? What's God going to do to bring back a remnant even? Bring people back and set up His Messiah? Who's He going to use? Foreign nations, right? And so Assyria is the big one in this first section of Isaiah. Remember the historical outline. And then Babylon is prophesied about, that would come after Assyria as well. But even as we studied last time, Babylon is going to be judged. They'll suffer punishment, and they'll cease to be. And that would be by the hands of the Medes. And then you'd have Greece, as we remember the statue of Nebuchadnezzar in his dream and what those sections of that statue represented. And then Rome would come, and that's when the Messiah would come, and then Rome would be no more as well, and the kingdom of the Messiah would stand. So you've got God using evil nations to bring about His wonderful plan of salvation, and those evil nations He's using, His tools, as we especially saw in Isaiah 10, they'll be judged too, because they're not thinking of themselves as God's servants. They're thinking of themselves as incredible warriors and being at the top of the world. And they're very harsh in their treatment with the people that they're conquering and that they're taking into captivity. And God will judge them as well. And all these other little nations around them that have had a history with Israel and Judah, they'd be judged as well, as they were in sin. We noted that last time. I tried to stress that regardless of what specific reasons are given in the text concerning a judgment of a nation, the general reason is always sin. God never just randomly destroys people. It's always because they were given a choice, and as we just studied, also a consequence to that choice, and so they'd be destroyed for their sin. We ended in chapter 14 last time, but really didn't get to look at Philistia very much, beginning in verse 29. I did want to, verse 28, I did want to consider something there before we get into chapter 15. You notice there in the judgment on Philistia, they're rejoicing. He says, basically another nation's going to come. Don't rejoice that who is likely Assyria, the rod that struck you is broken, because there's going to come someone after him, which is likely the Babylonians, and someone after them. And so you've got this line of people that are going to come and conquer you. It's not over yet. But notice in verse 30, it says, the firstborn of the poor will feed, and the needy will lie down in safety. We know those are the Jews. We know those are those in Zion, because in verse 32, he says, "What will they answer the messengers of the nation? That the Lord has founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall take refuge in it." And I wanted to point that out because what we're going to see with the judgment on Moab is that there is a place they could flee for refuge. And even more so, we're going to see with Moab and other nations as well, just like God is leaving a remnant of his people so that they could have hope and they would turn to the Messiah, so he does with the nations too. Moab is spoken of as having a remnant left, but they reject the hope that Jehovah is giving them. And so he's merciful even to the foreign nations. That should impress us. There's refuge in Zion because Zion is going to be the place, the holy city, where God brings about the Messiah and salvation. So in chapter 15 and 16, we have the burden or the oracle against Moab. The first question is, from whom does Moab descend? Looking at Genesis 19, verse 37. From Lot, right? His daughters got him drunk, and his firstborn gave birth to Moab, where the Moabites come from. And so they're related to Israel, aren't they? Did they have a good relationship with their kinsmen? Think back to the history. Good or bad? Bad, right? Real bad track record of beef, if you will, between Moab and Israel. And so you're going to kind of see that here as well to a degree. In chapter 16, their hope is to return their allegiance, their fidelity to the house of Israel, to Zion, sending tribute like they used to when they were subjugated by Israelites. And they are going to refuse because they're prideful and they're arrogant. Moab is to the east of the Dead Sea and between the Arnon River on the north and the Zered River on the south. We'll see some of that language in this particular text. In Psalm 60 and verse 8, you can kind of see how Moab is viewed by Israelites, but even Jehovah in the grand scheme of things, he calls them his washpot. And that's in a list of other people too who are being called certain things. And Moab, out of all things, is just a washpot. Very low estimation, very lowly status. We see Moab is prideful and arrogant in chapter 16. And so that will play into the sin that will bring them down and be their downfall. In 2 Samuel 8 and verse 2, it says that David defeated Moab, forcing them down to the ground. He measured them off with a line. With 2 lines, he measured off those to be put to death, and with 1 full line, those to be kept alive. So the Moabites became David's servants and brought tribute. We see an example of a tribute being brought in 2 Kings 3 and verse 4, a tribute brought to Israel. That Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder, and he regularly paid the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But then it happened when Ahab died that the king of Moab rebelled against the children of Israel. So a little background into some of the language we'll see in chapter 16 about sending a lamb to Zion. This text, like all of these texts concerning the judgment of the nations, is severe, and we'll actually see how it causes the prophet Isaiah, Jehovah as well, as he's bringing this judgment upon them, to feel, and it's not good. And so keep that in mind in all of this. God never wants to destroy anyone. God never wants anyone to perish. It always grieves him that people are not submitting to him, and he's just, so he has to deal out in punishment, but he doesn't enjoy it. We need to always keep that in mind. The world is going to make you believe that the God of the Old Testament especially is just the bully on an anthill. He's not love. He just wants to see the world burn. But that's not the case. He's always offered a way out of destruction, just like he does with Moab. And their ultimate hope in the Messiah, we see that out of pride they'll be rejecting. All right, so chapter 15 begins regarding Moab. The whole chapter is this first point about just how bad it's going to be. And one of the questions is, in chapter 15, 15 Moabite cities are listed. What are they? We're not going to have to do that right now. Just kind of gives you the idea of the scope of this judgment. In fact, 23 cities between chapter 15 and 16 are mentioned, 15 of them being in chapter 15. And I think all that he's trying to get us to understand is not what these cities are and what their significance is necessarily and have to know the geography of Moab, but this is widespread. This is happening all over Moab. They are being laid waste and destroyed. It says in verse 1, because in the night Ar of Moab is laid waste and destroyed, because in the night Ker of Moab is laid waste and destroyed. That's the burden against Moab. Ar is perhaps on the North Arnon River, and Ker is perhaps about 10 miles east of the south end of the Dead Sea. And that, again, for me at least, kind of shows the scope of this. From north to south, the land is being laid waste, and it says in a night, Ker of Moab is laid waste. So likely just when they're least expecting this, and that's usually how it is, isn't it? Even when ample warnings are being sent and they're called to repentance, various peoples are taken by surprise. They don't know the time of their destruction. We don't know the time of the coming of the Lord either in the final judgment, and it's going to overtake us, we read, like a thief in the night. It overtook Moab and their destruction when they least expected it. It says in verse 2 that he has gone up to the temple of Dibon, to the high places to weep. Moab will wail over Nebo and over Medeba, 2 cities of Moab, and on all their heads will be baldness and every beard cut off. When it says they go up to the temple in the high places, what is he talking about? Especially the high places. I think the temple's obvious, so there you go. There's a hint. They're false gods. Where do they turn to when destruction comes? They turn to their gods, the idols that they are worshiping, and they're crying and weeping for the false gods to hear and help them. It's not happening. It's not working. And so there's a picture of despondency, grief, and sorrow. They're bald. Their beards are cut off. And in verses 3 and 4, it says, in their streets they will clothe themselves with sackcloth. And on the tops of their houses and in their streets, everyone will wail, weeping bitterly. Everyone is involved in this. We know what sackcloth means. This is a terrible scene of destruction. They are being judged. Their voice will be heard as far as Jahaz, and so its idea of their cries are loud and can be heard from far away. Notice in verse 4, the armed soldiers of Moab will cry out. His life will be burdensome to him. So there's no hope at all. That they can't defend themselves. Their armed soldiers are crying in despair. You think about how great our military is and how unsettling that would be if the generals were crying and saying, we have no hope. There's nothing we can do about this. Just a terrible picture of destruction. So it is for Moab. Notice in verse 5, whether it's Jehovah or whether it's the prophet, we see the great grief and despair that comes because of what he's witnessing in prophecy Moab will undergo. My heart will cry out for Moab. His fugitives shall flee to Zoar like a 3-year-old heifer. For by the ascent of Lahuth, they will go up with weeping. For in the way of Horonaim, they will raise up a cry of destruction, so on and so forth. I want us to be impressed with that. My heart will cry out for Moab. It tells us a lot about the nature of Jehovah, who's obviously using Isaiah in this way. But even Isaiah, he's despondent. He is sorrowful over Moab's destruction. It's not something that brings joy to God or his people, and it shouldn't be to us. When we think about the destruction we're trying to warn people about in judgment, we're talking to them about how God's word is either going to be their salvation or their destruction. It shouldn't bring us any pleasure whatsoever that people are lost. And the Bible is laced with examples of God weeping over even very immoral people who don't care about him in the least. So it should be for us. Remember in Acts 20 and verse 31, Paul to the Ephesian elders said, watch and remember that for 3 years I did not cease to warn everyone night and day with tears. Remember the enemies of the cross of Christ in Philippians chapter 3, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and who glory in their shame. He says that, he says, of whom I've told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they're enemies of the cross of Christ. What did Paul think about his countrymen rejecting the Christ and having no hope, therefore? Remember in Romans chapter 9? What did he want to do? Yeah, he wanted to take their place. That should be our attitude. We shouldn't hold anything back. We should just tell the people who are destined for destruction because they're living ungodly lives that this will be the consequence. We do it with tears. We do it with sorrow. He speaks more about the war-torn country, desolate, green grass withered, grass fails, nothing green. Get down to verse 9. Notice he says, the waters of Dimon will be full of blood because I will bring more upon Dimon. And he mentions a remnant of the land there, but notice, even upon the remnant, lions will come upon him who escapes from Moab. So relentless judgment. Ultimately, a remnant will be left at the end of chapter 16. He speaks about a remnant that is very small and feeble, but ultimately, they would not take advantage of the hope God gives them. They'd eventually be completely wiped out. Comments, questions on chapter 15? All right, in chapter 16, there's no break really. It just continues the thought of Moab. But what it does is it speaks of hope that is offered Moab. Then it speaks about Moab's rejection of that hope. And then it speaks about the consequence of the day of visitation being set. Here you can escape this. I don't want to escape it. I'm good on my own. Okay, then you're going to be visited in judgment. There's interesting language here, though. It says in verse 1, send the land to the ruler of the land, from Selah to the wilderness, to the mount of the daughter of Zion. For it shall be as a wandering bird thrown out of the nest, so shall the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon, that river on the north. So there's a great question in this, and there's a way that seems logical to me, but there are scholars that have done much more studying than I have that believe differently, and they differ among themselves. And we'll see something similar in chapter 18 as well with the proclamation against Ethiopia. Who's speaking here? Who's telling who to send a lamb? Who's telling who there in verse 3? Take counsel, execute judgment, make your shadow like the night, hide the outcast, do not betray him who escapes. Let my outcast dwell with you, O Moab. We'll see a different translation of that, which doesn't necessarily imply that he's saying, Moab, you need to take in refugees. So who's talking, who's speaking? I think that it makes sense that you've got Jehovah or Isaiah speaking to Moab and telling them this is your only hope. Send a lamb like you did in times past to Zion. Send tribute to Zion. Curry their favor. Realign yourself with them. That's your only hope. And then telling Israel, or rather Jerusalem, to receive Moab. Don't put them away. Don't cast them aside. We notice in 2 Kings 3 an example of that tribute being sent. Verse 2 considers the confusion and the state of anxious and timid indecision for the daughters of Moab. We remember daughters of Jerusalem, the women of Moab. But then he says, take counsel, execute judgment. Is Moab speaking to Zion? I don't know. Is Isaiah speaking to Zion about receiving Moab? I don't know. What I do think seems to be clear is that Moab's the one who has a lot of problems coming their way, and Jehovah wants them to find refuge. And so here you have a cry for Zion to make their shadow like the night in the middle of the day. And so you think of a shadow as refuge, as a shield from the heat of the sun. It's this idea of protection. Make your shadow large in the middle of this noonday heat for these people. Don't deny them asylum. And then in verse 4, it says, let my outcast dwell with you, O Moab. Now what that makes it seem to be is that Moab is receiving these people that are fleeing from judgment. But consider the New American Standard Bible's rendering of the Hebrew. It says, give us advice, make a decision, cast your shadow like the night at high noon, hide the outcast, do not betray the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab stay with you. Be a hiding place to them from the destroyer, for the extortioner has come to an end. Destruction has ceased. Oppressors have completely disappeared from the land. That's what makes sense to me. You might have read it differently, but that's okay, because I don't have the answer for you. It seems to me like God is giving Moab safe haven in Zion and telling Zion, don't refuse them. Let them in. Let them find some salvation here with you in regard to from what is being destroyed. And evidently something had happened that would allow Zion to act in such a way. Devastation ceases and the oppressors are consumed out of the land. Now, when we get to verse 5, it's really very obviously messianic. And so while this may be looking to their destruction at this time and the hope for them to escape that physical destruction, ultimately it's looking to, just like with Israel, just like with Judah, a salvation spiritually within a messianic time. In verse 5 it says, "In mercy the throne will be established, and one," capital O, I know that's rendered by the translators, it's not in the original text, but I think it's correct, "will sit on it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking justice and hastening righteousness." And so the ultimate reason for refuge in Zion is the Messiah. That's what this is all looking forward to in the first place. Remember, I pointed out with Philistia in chapter 14:32, "The Lord has founded Zion, and the poor of his people shall take refuge in it." That certainly was true when Assyria was bearing down on them. They were delivered from Sennacherib and his men. We'll see that even in chapter 17. But it's ultimately looking to the time of the Messiah. What's the phrase there in verse 5 that really helps us understand that's it? Consideration. Tabernacle of David. Tabernacle of David. You remember the prophecies concerning the throne of David and the eternal reign of David and his seed on that. It looks to the Messiah. Remember in chapter 11, what is the Messiah called? A rod from the stem of who? Of Jesse, being David's father. And so we're talking about the Messiah in his reign here in righteousness and justice. And that's the ultimate hope. But in verse 6, you have Moab wanting nothing to do with it. And how sad is it that that is usually the case even today? God says, destruction's coming, but you don't have to be a part of that. And people just want to do what they want to do. Moab was notorious for their pride. We've heard the pride of Moab. He's very proud of his haughtiness and his pride and his wrath. But his lies shall not be so. The New American Standard Bible says his idle boasts are false. I think that's that idea of him being prideful and arrogant. Jeremiah later would prophesy against Moab, speaking of their pride. Moab shall be destroyed as a people because he exalted himself against the Lord. Jeremiah 48:7, because you have trusted in your works and your treasures, you shall also be taken. In Jeremiah 48 verse 14, he says, how can you say we are mighty and strong men for the war? Moab is plundered and gone up from her cities. Her chosen young men have gone down to the slaughter, says the king whose name is Lord of hosts. So obviously, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before the fall. And that's what the rest of the chapter describes. Moab is wailing for themselves in verse 7. He speaks about various matters that they gloried in. A very fertile land, evidently notable for their vineyards, fields and vines and choice plants and summer fruits and harvest and plentiful fields and vineyards and wine presses, describing all the way through the rest of the text of verses 8 through 12. All of that is going to be forsaken. Again, the prophet speaks of his own sorrow. I will bewail the vine of Sibmah, verse 9, with the weeping of Jazer. I will drench you with my tears. This makes him have zero joy. He doesn't want them to be destroyed. Doesn't want anyone to be destroyed. That's what's going to happen. Gladness is taken away and joy from the plentiful fields. So where they would be having plenty in their harvest and gleaning the grapes of their vineyards and rejoicing in what they have been blessed with abundantly, there's going to be sorrow and wailing and crying, and it's going to be terrible for them. It will come to pass in verse 12, when it is seen that Moab is weary on the high place, he will come to his sanctuary to pray, but he will not prevail. Again, like we saw in chapter 15, let's turn to our gods, and it's not going to work. Praying to them will do nothing. So notice in verse 13, since they rejected the hope, this is what's going to happen. The word which the Lord has spoken concerning Moab since that time, evidently Isaiah had prophesied about Moab before this at another time, and this is somewhat repetition of that prophecy. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, within 3 years as the years of a hired man. When a man reaches an agreement and a contract, you're going to work 3 years. Does he work any longer after that 3 years is up? if the contract is extended, but I'm going to work for 3 years, I'm not going to work for any more, you're not going to keep paying me, that's it. That's the point. 3 years, that's it. It's going to come, and it's certain. The glory of Moab will be despised with all the great multitude. The remnant will be very small and feeble. Comments or questions with that?
Jeremiah, I think you've done a really good job in reminding us of really what's continuing to go on, and that is the idea of hope, but you must be prepared.
Yeah.
And if you are prepared and you prepare yourself, then forgiveness will be given.
Yeah.
But justice will always occur. And so the lesson as we move forward, as you talked about through up to Matthew in the Gospels, is prepare, forgiveness is given, stay committed, and blessings will be ours.
Yeah, that's a great point. The point you made that justice will be served, that's why all this is conditional. All of sin falls short of the glory of God. Every one of us is deserving of the kind of destruction we're reading about in the prophets concerning the nations. And that's why Zion is the only refuge, because what happened at Zion is the justice of God occurred in the death of Christ. And the only way that you can avoid that destruction is by partaking of the benefits of His death. And that requires this kind of obedience and faith and fidelity. We've got to return to the Lord. That's an excellent point. Throughout all of this, even these difficult parts of the prophets is hope, and we should find peace in that. In chapter 17, we have Damascus. That is the capital of Syria. Then we have Israel, and then we have a reference even to Assyria. The reference to Israel and Assyria are kind of a side point that come along with Damascus. He says that Damascus will cease from being a city. It will be a ruinous heaps. And then he mentions cities of Damascus. They'll be for flocks which lie down. No one will make them afraid. Fortress will cease from Ephraim. Remember, that's Israel. And the kingdom from Damascus. And the remnant of Syria. They will be as the glory of the children of Israel, which he goes on to describe the decimation of Israel as well. Why would he mention Israel with Syria or Damascus? What have we studied this far? Yeah, remember, you've got Assyria coming, and so Syria and Israel, they join forces to go against Judah and set up a puppet king. In chapter 7, we saw that. And so they're conspiring against Judah. Remember what Ahaz was told, it's not going to happen. So don't join an alliance with Assyria. Don't worry about Syria and about Israel, because they're going to fail. But Ahaz looked to Assyria, opened the door for him, and Assyria became his downfall as well. But you've got Damascus being judged for that in part, and then you've got Israel being judged along with it. And he kind of looks to some of that language with Israel. He speaks about his fatness becoming lean. He talks about just barely a remnant being left with all this language about the vegetation and the gleanings of grapes, and some are left, and the shaking of an olive tree, some are left. But notice verse 7, in that day a man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will have respect for the Holy One of Israel. He'll not look to the altars, the work of his hands. He will not respect what his fingers have made, nor the wooden images, nor the incense altars. So you were trusting in idols here, and when times get bad, then you'll look back to Jehovah. And really that's what judgment is all about in that regard, to bring them to repentance. Sometimes it's too little too late. Notice in verse 10, one of the reasons why. Because you have forgotten the God of your salvation and have not been mindful of the rock of your stronghold, therefore you will plant pleasant plants and set out forward seedlings. In the day you will make your plant to grow, and in the morning you will make your seed to flourish. But the harvest will be a heap of ruins in the day of grief and desperate sorrow. So they went to foreign seedlings. They said, I'm going to trust in Assyria, not in Jehovah, the rock of refuge in my fortress. Remember in chapter 8, a chapter that we quoted from in our sermon this morning, he said that the Lord of hosts, to him you shall hallow, him you shall fear. He will be a sanctuary, but a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense to those who are disobedient, not faithful. So that's the point. You thought that you would reap good fruit from foreign plants, but then you reaped ruin. And that's exactly what happens. So at the end of the chapter, in verses 12 through 14, he speaks about this multitude of many people making a noise like the roar of the seas. nations rushing in like many waters. God's going to rebuke them, and He's going to judge them. He says in verse 14, "At eventide, trouble, before the morning He is no more. This is the portion of those who plunder us, and the lot of those who rob us." Us being Israel, God's people. Who did that to them? Assyria. So He doesn't mention them by name, but He uses a lot of the same descriptions we see in chapter 8 and also chapter 10 of Assyria, and they'll be plundered or they'll be destroyed as well. Notice in verse 14, though, He says, "At eventide, trouble, and before the morning He is no more." How was Assyria taken care of when they come up against Jerusalem? Remember, they're shaking their fists at the end of chapter 10, but they're cut down. How did God do that? We see it in the historical section of Isaiah. Remember? An angel of the Lord in the night, destroying 185,000 of them, causing Sennacherib and the rest of his men to flee. And so I believe that's what he's referencing here in verse 14. God would destroy those who destroyed His people, using them and judging them for their iniquity. Then we get to chapter 18. And this is the one people that are addressed without this burden. A burden against Damascus, a burden against Moab, so on and so forth. But he says, "Woe to the land shrouded with buzzing wings, which is beyond the rivers of Ethiopia." Depending on your translation, it might say Cush, which is a reference to Ethiopia. So it's not this burden on Ethiopia, but he's addressing Ethiopia for a reason. The AV and ESV say, "Ah." The New American Standard Bible, "alas," and the Young's literal translation, "ho." So not even woe, but listen up, speaking to them, not against them. It's not a burden. And what this will do, kind of just a quick summary of it, is Ethiopia is fearing some people that are coming down. That would be the Assyrians. Destroying Israel, coming up against Judah. Ethiopia is further south of them. And so they're worried. What are they going to do? They're going to be next after Judah. They're going to be destroyed. So what they're going to do is they're going to send some ambassadors to Judah, say, "Hey, we need to band together and help each other in this regard." Now here's another question. Who's saying what? In verse 2, "Send ambassadors by the sea, even in vessels of reed on the waters." Saying is supplied. Some of the translations don't have it. "Go swift messengers to a nation tall and smooth of skin," so on and so forth. Who's speaking? Who's talking there? Not everyone agrees. But what I think seems to be the case is that Ethiopia is sending ambassadors, and Isaiah or Jehovah is telling His people, don't accept it. We've already talked about alliance with foreign nations. That's not acceptable to God. You need to just trust in Him. Send them back to Ethiopia, to a nation with people of tall and smooth of skin. Send them back. We're not going to join that. What we're going to do is, instead of panicking, understand that the Lord is resting, but He's not unconcerned. He's not uninterested in this. He's waiting for the fruit to ripen like the clear heat sunshine, the cloud of dew, and the heat of harvest. He's waiting for things to ripen. Remember in chapter 10, it says in verse 12, "Therefore it shall come to pass when the Lord has performed all His work on Mount Zion and on Jerusalem, He will say, I will punish the fruit of the arrogant heart of the king of Assyria and the glory of his haughty looks." Jehovah's going to act, but He's got to wait for things to complete first. He's waiting. He's resting. He's not losing His mind. Neither should you, Zion, and neither should you, Ethiopia. Send them back. God's going to take care of this, and then they will be left together for mountain birds of prey, so on and so forth. He'll defeat them. And when He defeats them, in verse 7, you've got Ethiopia bringing a present to the Lord in Zion, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, to Mount Zion. Again, looking forward to even furthermore when nations would come to Zion and render themselves obedient to Him. That was the second light flash, wasn't it? It wasn't. It was the first one. I got time. I rushed through that, and I still have time. All right, so consider that in a little more detail then. In verse 4 especially, "The Lord said to me, I will take my rest, and I will look from my dwelling place like clear heat and sunshine, like a cloud of dew in the heat of harvest." Even in a time of great destruction, even in a time of judgment, we find some assurance and we find some confidence in how God works. God rules in the kingdoms of men. He has been active all the way up to this point in Isaiah, and as he's judging these nations, and these nations are acting ungodly, and they are looking to conquest and conquering of other peoples and dealing very harshly with them. And especially God's people will wonder, what about us? And is God caring? And does He see? Sometimes we feel that way. Just because we can't identify something as necessarily an action of God in our favor for our protection, while things may seem like everything's going wrong and does God care? God knows what's going on. And He's resting. And all He's doing is He's waiting for things to ripen in His time. Throughout Isaiah, especially in the second half in the Babylonian period, with the historical outline when the messianic prophecies, the prophecies of the servant, they're coming pouring in and trust in the Messiah and in Jehovah is being encouraged. When you're going to have a lot of stuff to deal with in Babylonian captivity, trust in Him. We see the phrase, wait on the Lord, time and time again. I see that here in Isaiah 18 and verse 4. Think of Ethiopia sending, he calls them swift messengers. They're sending them swiftly. We've got to figure this out. If Syria is knocking on our door, we're the next to be slain. And we've heard about everything that's happened to all these other nations. Judah, we got to get our act together. Jerusalem, we got to figure something out. And what Isaiah is saying, send them back. The Lord's resting, but He's just letting this ripen. And then He's going to take care of them. He's going to deal with the Assyrians like He has said He will deal with the Assyrians. And so I think that there's a practical point to that. What can we learn from that as individual Christians in that regard as we go through troublesome times in our life? Well, how does God work with the negative in our life? I don't know all the time, but does He use it for our good, for our benefit? Wasn't Assyria being used to judge sin and also bring about the next step in God's plans to bring the Messiah? Babylon would have to rise to power, but Assyria would have to do their work first before Babylon comes as well. And the Medes would have to come to destroy Babylon, and you'd have to have the Grecians to come and destroy the Medes, and then you'd have to have the Romans set up, and then it's time. The fullness of times have come. So all this stuff is happening, but in God's time. One day is as 1,000 years to Him, and 1,000 years is one day. And what we've got to do as individuals is realize that He can use those negative things for some good. And we've always got to appreciate it as it corresponds to His purposes. It's not necessarily the case that all of these bad things are going to lead to this crescendo of blessings in my physical life. But it will lead to God's will for you to be saved if you approach it in that regard. Romans 8, all things work together for good to those who love God. If we submit to Him and we look to Him, He can use that thorn in our side like He used with the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12, and He can use it to strengthen us. Because when we're weak, then we're strong as we look to Him. So the applications really are endless. We'll be in, Lord willing, on Wednesday, chapter 19. We'll conclude this section on the judgments of the nations. And then on that next Sunday, Harry's going to take that last part of this section in regard to the generalities of all that we've studied in regard to the world judgment, beginning in chapter 24. Thank you for your kind attention.